Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our discussion series on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Every second Monday, Dr. Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and host Maya Matsuoka, host a discussion on the latest developments, new challenges, and shifts in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on the Japanese politics, business insights, and the Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Good evening to everybody who has joined us already. Today again we have Dr. Stephen Nagy joining us. You already know him very well. So today we're going to talk about convergent and divergent views of the Indo-Pacific. There is quite a lot to talk about, I believe, and once Stephen finishes his briefing, we'll open the room to discussion. So please raise your hand, let me know, and I'll bring you up on stage. Without any further delay, Stephen, let's start.
All right, Maya, so thank you very much for having me this morning, and good morning from Calgary. It's 5 a.m. here, so I'm excited to speak at this early in the morning. But before I jump into this discussion on convergences and divergences of the Indo-Pacific, I wanted to just make a note and share my views about the passing or the unfortunate death of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. And I think this is, it's tragic for Japan, it's tragic for the region for many reasons, but one of the key reasons related to today's discussion is that he was really the person that put the idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific on the table back in 2007 in India at a speech to their parliament discussing the so-called confluence of two seas. And it was his diplomacy, his vision that I think has been adopted in part, or at least localized in many countries, including the United States, Denmark, Germany, the European Union, of course, Japan, the United States. We have the South Koreans talking about building and creating their own Indo-Pacific vision. The UK, although they don't have an Indo-Pacific vision per se, they've incorporated into their integrated defense strategy. The French have one, and Australia recognizes itself as an Indo-Pacific country. And when you drill down into some of its defense strategy texts, it talks about the Indo-Pacific. So I just would like to recognize the late Prime Minister's enormous contributions to this concept. And they have been internationalized and they have been institutionalized to a certain degree in many places. And this will be his lasting legacy in terms of foreign policy in the broader region. So I wish his family and, of course, the former Prime Minister, I'd like to just send my condolences to both because I think they were such important, Prime Minister Abe was such an important actor on the foreign policy front. So let's just pivot from that initial comment about former Prime Minister Abe, and let's talk about the Indo-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific region's convergences and divergences. Now, I think what we can do is we can create a continuum of where we sit in terms of concepts or conceptualizations of the Indo-Pacific. On the one hand, I think the most watered down, or I guess the one that has the less concrete aspects of it, would be the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook, and I'll come back to that. The one that is probably the most securitized would be the former United States president's Indo-Pacific strategy, that is the Trump Indo-Pacific strategy. And between those two bookends, we see a lot of different interpretations of what the Indo-Pacific strategy or vision or guideline should be. And I think this is an important kind of way to help us understand the direction of the evolution of the Indo-Pacific. So let's start with the Indo-Pacific, the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook, and what are some of the distinguishing features of this particular document. And I think that really in looking at the history of the Indo-Pacific outlook of ASEAN, really, we should understand that it was a response to a growing number of countries creating Indo-Pacific visions, and that ASEAN was feeling that it was losing its central position within the regional integration process. And what I mean by that is that since 1997, that Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia as they were integrating their economy, they agreed that the ASEAN way, or the consensus-based decision-making process that was formed in the amongst the initial 6 members of ASEAN, and then of course when they added the rest, the 10 members of ASEAN, they agreed that the way to move forward in terms of growth and economic and political integration was that all the members needed to agree upon whatever the decision was through consensus. And they felt that ASEAN centrality needed to be respected and promoted as part of this integration process. So what we saw as a response to seeing Japan and the United States and other countries adopt Indo-Pacific strategies, that ASEAN felt that it was really important to conceptualize its ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook, stressing the importance of ASEAN centrality and consensus-based decision-making, and that the way forward to connect the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean must place ASEAN centrality as the cornerstone of that integration process. The agreement itself says very little about security, except that it doesn't want a securitized region. It stresses that consensus-based decision-making should be the way that the region moves forward in terms of integration. And it talks a little bit about how the ASEAN region really connects. It's the land bridge for the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. And this is really the characteristic feature. No concrete policies, not really focused on economic integration or development or infrastructure connectivity. Rather, it really focuses on this idea of ASEAN centrality. On the other end of the spectrum, we have, I think, the Indo-Pacific strategy that emerged out of the United States under the Trump administration. Now, while this is not representative of the current Biden administration's focus, what we saw is that the Trump administration took on an Indo-Pacific strategy, mostly thanks to the guidance of the late Prime Minister Abe. And this became a very securitized document. And when we look through the Indo-Pacific strategy, both the official one, but also the one that was released, the redacted version that was released, really it was a securitized way to think about the Indo-Pacific region with China deeply in mind. It didn't think about this idea of economic integration as critical to building stability within the region. It didn't really think about trade and trade agreements like the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership as important in building a more cohesive region. And this is why we saw the Trump administration, or one of the reasons why the Trump administration left the TPP-11. The Indo-Pacific strategy out of the United States talked about democracy, human rights, and it was in many ways not an inclusive kind of agreement. And what I mean inclusive is that because it talked about democracy, because it talked about human rights, because it talked about a securitized approach with China, it excluded many partners. For a country like Vietnam, and I say we have a few Vietnamese friends online like Phong and Han and Lin, because it focused on these value-oriented and a securitized approach, it really excluded countries like Vietnam, many other countries in Southeast Asia, and other countries that have very strong economic relations with China, that literally can't choose between the two countries. Now, the initial Indo-Pacific strategy was not static. It did evolve out of the United States. It evolved to have funding for example, infrastructure, where they worked between the Japanese and the Australians and the Americans to build and fund infrastructure by giving loans to private businesses. So this is a distinguishing feature, although many would say that it was not very effective. We saw that the United States, under the former administration, also increased the number of security forms of cooperation within the region. And we saw is that, again, China was the center of the Indo-Pacific strategy, and this created challenges for many of the countries whose greatest and biggest trading partner is China. Now, today's Biden administration and how they look at the Indo-Pacific strategy seems to understand that it's not just about security. They seem to understand that standards are critically important to shaping the region's future, and this is why we see the emergence of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF. We see that the Biden administration seems to understand that multilateral cooperation with the Quad, Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, and AUKUS are important ways to inculcate deterrence within the region, but also shape the next generation of technologies that will shape the region, including its governance structures. But we still see trade, in particular opening up the U.S. market, as not a critical part of the Biden administration's approach to the Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, those are the bookends. Now, when we look into the center, I think we see countries and regions with very similar approaches to thinking about the Indo-Pacific. And now, Japan is really important here. Again, Japan, under Prime Minister Abe, brought forth and manifested the free and open Indo-Pacific vision. And this vision really focuses on promoting a rules-based order. So what that means is that rules are the primary arbiter and last arbiter of how states deal with conflict and disagreement within the region. And they wanted to bolster that and improve that by getting buy-in by as many states as possible. And there was a strong feeling that, in particular China, but also North Korea, was issuing international law to pursue either weapons of mass destruction in the case of North Korea, or in the case of China, pursuing territories that belong to Japan or Southeast Asian countries in the East China Sea and South China Sea. So Japan's conceptualization of a free and open Indo-Pacific vision really focused on a rules-based order, in particular in the maritime environment, but also in the terrestrial area, such as the Himalayan plateau. But they also focused on development, infrastructure and connectivity, institution building, and a non-normative approach or non-value approach to cooperation. And here we see Japan cooperate with Vietnam, Brunei, Singapore, India, as many countries as possible. And what's distinguishing about this is that they cooperate with socialist states, theocracies, soft authoritarian states, states that are challenged in terms of their democracy. And the view from Tokyo is basically that you can't exclude the partners that you want if you want to build a region. And rules-based process and institution building will take time in terms of cooperation, ensuring that concepts such as ASEAN centrality and consensus-based decision-making are the key pillar of how any kind of Indo-Pacific strategy moves forward. Use this concept to expand and make an inclusive as possible vision that does not necessarily exclude China, but it's meant to constrain China's behavior in the maritime domain and hopefully pull it in a different direction so that it is more rules-based in how it functions with the international community in the Indo-Pacific. But also, there's hope in the Tokyo context that the approaches and the norms and the values, or the approaches to cooperation that Tokyo is promoting through the free and open Indo-Pacific vision would be something that could internationalize or shape initiatives coming out of Beijing, such as the Belt Road Initiative. Now, whether that's going to be successful or not, it's really too early to say, but that has been the broader approach of the Japanese. And it continues to be the approach under the Kishida administration. And we saw this at the Shangri-La Dialogue, where Prime Minister Kishida talked very openly about the free and open Indo-Pacific as the basis for his Kishida vision of peace for the broader region. Now, very similar to the Japanese concept is looking at the German Indo-Pacific guidelines. They don't explicitly mention China, but they do talk about the challenges to a rules-based order within the region and how this could affect trade, it could affect institution building, and it could affect how this most critical part of the world's global economy moves forward. And the Germans, when they formulated their strategy back in 2000, were really thinking about how they could continue to enjoy the economic benefits of their relationship with China, while at the same time, like the Japanese, constrain Chinese behavior through cooperation and through participating in many kinds of multilateral and multi-layered agreements, such as the Japan-EU economic partnership, but also increasing German presence within the region diplomatically and in terms of security. The Germans today have changed the tune quite a bit with regards to how they're thinking about the Indo-Pacific region. And this change has come primarily through the influence of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They now seem to understand that the challenge of Russia to Ukraine in terms of a rules-based order could actually occur in the Indo-Pacific region with a country like China, and this could fundamentally destabilize German economic interests within the region. And as a result, they are investing more of their diplomatic and economic resources in the region. Not so much on the security side, but focusing on similar pillars to the Japanese in a way to try to constrain the Chinese assertive behavior within the region. And this is done by helping stakeholders within the region build up their own capacities so that they can have more strategic autonomy. Other visions, such as the Denmark vision, really resonate very closely with the Germans. The French vision for the Indo-Pacific really is based on their actual geographic presence within the region. So the French actually have territories within the Indo-Pacific region, in particular the Pacific Islands, and they feel that they have a stake in ensuring that this region remains rules-based and not dominated by one superpower or the other. The EU has also adopted an Indo-Pacific vision, and that vision is broad, very similar to the German vision. It outlines the importance of rules. It outlines the importance of building institutions. It outlines the importance of ensuring that non-traditional security issues such as climate change, piracy, illegal fishing do not destabilize this critical and important area of economic intercourse that will really be the center of global trade in the years to come. The EU Indo-Pacific strategy does not explicitly criticize China, but it does explicitly make references to concerns about destabilizing behavior. Again, this is an important way to be thinking about how the Europeans themselves want to maintain that strong relationship with China. They understand the economic benefits associated with China. They understand that they are geographically distant from China, and as a result don't face the same pressures as countries directly in its backyard, but they do recognize at the same time that some of the behavior that they've been seeing is highly destabilizing and it could affect European interests. Now, the European Union's Indo-Pacific strategy, of course, requires consensus from all its members, and this is very, very interesting, the internal dynamics. When I was in Europe in May and June, I heard a lot about this, is that while there are some countries like Hungary and others that have a closer relationship with China and a more interest-based approach to their foreign policy, is that they were willing to accept the European Union's strategy because it was allowed them to have to support their position within the European Union and the broader European Union's Indo-Pacific strategy, while at the same time they could have their national approach to dealing with China, where they could basically retain those strong relationships with China and refrain from criticizing it directly as part of its own diplomacy within the region. So again, let's just review. We have a continuum of views about what the Indo-Pacific vision is. I guess the softest or the least institutionalized one is the Asean Indo-Pacific outlook. And this is not a criticism, it's just a characterization. And the most securitarized version was probably the one out of the Trump administration, which has become slightly less securitarized under the Biden administration, with recognition of the importance of trade, standard setting, alliances, and balancing deterrence, resilience, and engagement. And then within the middle, I think the Japanese, the Germans have a lot of overlap in their views about the Indo-Pacific strategy, but Japan being geographically within the region, they have a more proactive approach. And of course, tremendous resources and historical footprint within the region. And then the Danish and the European Union and the French have their own views that really resonate with much of what we see coming out of Germany and the EU in general. So I'll stop there. That's the kind of convergences and divergences I see, and I'd love to hear views from others in the room.
Thank you, Stephen. Do you think that if the Chinese Communist Party was not so assertive in this region, things would look differently? Or
So I think that the broader pattern of the Chinese over the past 25 years, at least since the Asian financial crisis in 1997, has been positive. It has been also assertive. It has also been stabilizing. It has also been destabilizing. Let me talk about the positive side. In 1997, at the Asian financial crisis, under Chinese leadership, whether it was the CCP or not, they kept their markets open to Southeast Asian countries so that they could continue to import into China. This was an economic lifeline to help our Southeast Asian countries continue to grow and not further drop into poverty as currency devaluation severely damaged Thailand, Indonesia, and others within the region. The Chinese economic growth really has benefited all of Southeast Asia and arguably Japan, South Korea, Australia, and others, because basically many goods could be produced cheaply in China and bought in these other countries to help them improve their quality of life. There's been tremendous investment by China into these countries in terms of businesses, its infrastructure connectivity in the form of the Belt Road Initiative. It's been a very positive experience in many ways. Assertive? Yes. We have assertive behavior that has really increased in the 2000s, and in particular under Xi Jinping in the East China Sea with regards to the Senkakus, belligerence across the Taiwan Straits, island building in the South China Sea, and of course aggression on the Himalayan plateau. This assertive behavior has had limits, but still it's been destabilizing, and it's created severe challenges for many smaller and mid-sized countries because they understand that their biggest economic partner is China, but they do have some challenges in terms of certain security areas, and this is something that they continue to worry about. It's also been stabilizing. As I mentioned, its economic growth has helped raise not only the decreased poverty in the Chinese context, but its growth has also decreased poverty throughout the region. Destabilizing, and I think this is where we're going to be moving into right now. It's been destabilizing in terms of its COVID policies, disruptions to supply chains. I have concerns about the housing challenges moving forward and how this will impact Chinese domestic debt, but will there be spillover into many other countries? So I think when we characterize China, it's important to say it has positive influences. It's been assertive, it's been stabilizing, it's also been destabilizing in different areas. And these four, I guess, adjectives or characteristics have caused many countries to start to think about how they can manage their relationship with China and build coexistence into that relationship. And I think that this Indo-Pacific vision approach has now become more important in that process.
We've got Lynn and Eleanor here with us. Hello, Lynn. Hello, Eleanor.
Morning to both Stephen and Maya, and it's nice that for once Stephen is actually awake earlier than me, and in the same and in the same hemisphere. It's nice to not, or at least from the speaker standpoint, be the only one who can say it's morning. So great to be with you both as well as everyone else in the room. I'll be brief with my comments so that we could have more time for conversation with other potential speakers. But yeah, what I found interesting, I've been thinking a lot about Prime Minister Abe lately, as well as Stephen and many others who closely watched Japan foreign policy and whatnot. But I think one thing that we should definitely give Abe credit for, at the very least when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, is, which I think Stephen did imply, is that he was very much ahead of his time in regards to, how, the onus is on Japan and like-minded countries to really shape China's behaviors so that countries that are part of the Indo-Pacific region and even stakeholders with interest in the Indo-Pacific region, like Stephen mentioned, European countries, can live in a world where we live on a rules-based order. And I think Stephen was talking about the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy in both the Trump and Biden administrations. And yes, there are those differences in the Biden administration about ideas, a bit about trade, minilateralism, some of which, of course, did precede the Biden administration, like the Quad. So there is a bit of continuity as well. But on the other hand, I think the biggest issue from a Washington perspective when it comes to the U.S. strategy in the Indo-Pacific region is how do we, we do tend to securitize a lot of things when it comes to China. But I think what the Japanese are much better at than the United States right now, and I think Abe is a big reason for this, not the only reason though, I might add, but is how do we coexist with China beyond the current state of where we are at when it comes to strategic competition. I think the Japanese mentality, historically, Japan and China have engaged for over 1,500 years, as the late Ezra Bogle wrote in his last book on China-Japan relations, is that, from the Japanese perspective, China is too big to fail in every way possible, whether it be economic, diplomatic, political, even people-to-people ties, I would argue. But I think in the United States, because so much of our bilateral relationship with China has become securitized, I don't know if that kind of mentality is as prevalent and within the decision makers here in Washington. And I think going forward, if we don't make it that way, make it so that there is still some room for cooperation when necessary at the very least, then I don't know if the Indo-Pacific could be so that it can thrive in the rules-based order to the extent that all of us want it to be. So I'll see what reactions I spark from that comment. But thanks for letting me join the stage as always.
I think at this stage, we're not sure where the Biden and the United States is going in terms of its Indo-Pacific strategy, but it's still largely securitized until it pivots in a different direction. It's going to be difficult to get a lot of stakeholder buy-in. But I do think they've done some interesting things that will place Japan, Canada, European countries, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, maybe Singapore in some uncomfortable positions. And I think that once the American Compete Acts comes into fruition, it's going to compel many of us to take a different approach when it comes to China. And I'm not sure if this is the right approach or not, but it's going to create challenges in terms of technological cooperation, business cooperation, sharing technologies, investing in China. And this will create a more securitized approach to dealing with China, which may make coexistence more difficult. And rather than coexistence, we're going to see kind of a bifurcation of the international system in terms of trade, technology, governance forms, which may be more destabilizing than stabilizing. So this is a bit of a concern I have with the United States approach to the region. And I think that it still needs to have a more nuanced approach to how it's building an inclusive approach to forging an Indo-Pacific strategy that moves beyond just a deterrence and security sphere to one that ensures that coexistence is the final destination in any kind of strategy.
Yes, I can hear you guys. Yes, great comment from Stephen. I do love the quote of "Twin in Washington." That's a great title to have, I guess.
Indeed, yes. And Lynn.
Yes, so good afternoon from Vietnam.
Hi, Lynn.
So honestly, hello. So honestly, I have been feeling quite overwhelmed with a lot of stories covering the passing of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in recent time, because he's also one of my favorite people. So before and during I did my research relating to Abe's individual leadership, I could say that I heard more about opinions from the Japanese side that they don't like Abe or they are not in favor of his leadership. However, after the passing of Abe, what I find after having very quick looks of comments as well as sharing of people on social media is most recognize his contributions to Japan or praising his influence on the Japanese politics, or generally quite positive views about his initiatives like the Quad or the Indo-Pacific vision. So I think my questions to Professor Stephen is, do you think that there has been a positive change in the public view, I mean, in both the Japanese society and the international community about Abe and his legacy after his passing? Because personally, I feel that it is much positively changed and widely recognized by the international community. So what did you think? Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. And it's really great to hear from you. And I'm so happy that you're still engaged in these discussions despite graduating. And I think that's really, really great. I hope you'll continue to do this moving forward. So I have a few comments here. And I'm gonna plagiarize Geroid Reddy, who just wrote an article for Bloomberg that I encourage you to read. But he highlights in his research, which was really interesting, that when Prime Minister Abe came back into power, this is during the Obama administration, and the foreign policy circles there, including John Kerry and others, they were very critical. They said there's nothing positive about Prime Minister Abe coming back into power. They viewed him as a nationalist, a militarist. It was an interpretation that was right out of the far left criticisms of Japan and the Liberal Democratic Party. And contrasting that to, I think, the strategic community today, the policy-oriented community today, that is fundamentally different. I think whether it's former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd writing about Prime Minister Abe, Ian Bremmer, the South Korean President Yoon, Singaporean Prime Minister Lee, have, as well as many others, have looked at Prime Minister Abe's foreign policy legacy as largely positive, that seen him as responsible for resurrecting Sino-Japanese relations after their low point following the nationalization of the Senkaku Islands. We saw, hyper diplomacy in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and that, he's recognized for spearheading the Japan-EU economic partnership, keeping the Trans-Pacific Partnership together, for so-called being the Trump whisperer to try and push Mr. Trump in more positive directions. I think largely Japan's relationship with almost every country, except for North Korea and South Korea, improved under Prime Minister Abe during his second period. And I find this really interesting. Now, what happened with South Korea? I think this was an interactive process. Of course, the Moon administration, I think, politicized the relationship and prioritized North Korea. And I think that this created challenges in the bilateral relations that are now being hopefully repaired under the Yoon administration. But it's important for you to look at how he was initially assessed when he came into power by the Obama administration and how is he assessed today, to get a better sense of his foreign policy legacy that I think is largely positive. On the domestic front, I think that there's more room for criticism. Abenomics initially garnered some momentum, but today, arguably, and I think Raymond from Singapore may add value to this, it's seen in particular on the deregulation side as a failure. On womenomics, it could have been better. It moved the dial, but it wasn't positive enough. In terms of wage increase, it moved the dial, but not positive enough. In terms of fundamentally reshaping the Japanese society and its appetite for risk, and getting young people to be more risk-oriented and entrepreneurial, here again, I think the legacy is mixed. So I think it's important to look at change over time and split your assessment in terms of foreign policy legacy and domestic policy legacy, and look at the policy and pragmatism. And this is important to get a better sense of how we can understand his legacy, in particular on the free and open Indo-Pacific vision.
Ken, hello.
Hello. Hi, Maya. Hi, Stephen. Thank you for your interesting topic.
Thanks, Ken.
I have a quick comment and a related question. And my comment is that being a Japanese living in Singapore, I don't have a particular insight about what people think here, but I do read the local papers. And I remember somebody gave opinion some time ago about China's sort of approach to Singapore, and in which he was sort of when China said, one China, that include Hong Kong, Macau, and probably Taiwan from Beijing standpoint. And Singapore is 70% ethnically Chinese, and Chinese language is used next to English. And then I think several years ago, Beijing said, to contribute to great Chinese culture, overseas Chinese should also contribute to help. And then this opinion I saw specifically worried about that kind of approach, that Singaporeans should make Chinese understand that Singapore is based on multi-ethnicity society with Malay and Indians and others. And that's how Singapore sort of should keep the distance from China. So my related question is, looking at the Ukraine crisis, I think Putin wrote something a few years back that Ukraine shares the same cultural root with Russia, therefore sort of try to justify the invasion. And so my question is, do you feel any danger or possibility that Beijing should start to prepare like a foreshadowing future intervention that use a culture going back hundreds of years, or maybe 1,000, 2,000 years, to talk about this having the same roots? And Japan, in a way, learned a lot from China. And in that, I lived in China 20 years ago, in Shanghai, and there was one shocking experience I had. Was I was at the market, and auntie asked me where I'm from, and I used my broken Chinese to say, 我们从东京来的, Dongqing is Tokyo, no? And then old lady sort of puzzled, Beijing, Nanjing, Dongqing, and then her daughter said, oh, mom, these are Japanese. Dongqing is Tokyo, no? But at that time I realized there's a Beijing and Nanjing, and probably Xi'an is a Western capital. Then, and also I read a crazy tabloid in Japan that Russia may use Ainu people's, cultural difference from Japanese, and they will help Ainu's independence from Hokkaido or something like that. So I think that's stupidity of the tabloid. But particularly a place like Singapore has a lot of Chinese influence. So I'd just like to hear your comment on this sort of cultural issue. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Ken. I think it's really important that we all have experiences in China and live there and learn their languages. So a salute to you for being in Shanghai and studying Mandarin. I think that gives you a certain wisdom. With regards to the core aspect of your question, the focus on will, culture, and China's historical footprint within the region be used as a tool to strengthen its influence throughout the region? I think yes is the question. It's not a strange or abnormal, I guess, approach. You know, there's ethnic Chinese communities in Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, and these are used through the United Work Front to try and create bridges to those countries and to try and create stronger, let's say, Philippine-China ties. And they do this through cultural exchanges, through economic exchanges. So I don't think this is unnatural. And I think there's some similarities to, for example, chambers of commerce, where the United States sets up a chamber of commerce in Japan or China, and that's used to build stronger bilateral relations. I think the difference maybe is the changing interpretation of China of what they call overseas Chinese. And this is the sense that China can claim, today's mainland China claims a kind of citizenship of anybody that's ethnically Chinese overseas, and that they can in many ways treat them differently even though that they have citizenship from another country. And we've seen this, where ethnic Chinese that have Swedish citizenship, Thai citizenship, or otherwise are arrested under Chinese law because they're ethnically Chinese. Now, how does this relate in terms of the free and open Indo-Pacific vision? I think that China has a different view about what the region should look like. They view the region should be China-centered, that U.S. influence within the region, and that includes alliances, should be pushed out, and that from today's government's point of view is that there should be a natural hierarchy based on historical relations and the size of countries, and that will be the basis for how the region organizes itself. There's a strong sense that, and if you're interested in this, there's a theory in international relations called relational theory by a prominent Chinese scholar called Qin Ya-qin, and he talked about how Chinese relations with neighbors were based on a mixture of Confucianism and mutually beneficial relations. And I think this is the direction that China is aiming for, based on using some of its ethnic Chinese connections to build strong bridges and engage in those societies.
It doesn't look to me like, I mean, those ethnic Chinese who live in other countries and do not have Chinese citizenship would be really, would give consent to China and the Chinese government to treat them as Chinese citizens.
Well, it's not treating as Chinese citizens, but the concept of being an overseas Chinese is that, you know, you're always part of the Chinese nation. And that this is a new conceptualization that has really occurred over the past 20 years. And as a result, it creates challenges in terms of how, you know, countries like Canada, where I'm from, or the United States or Australia understand citizenship. Citizenship comes before whatever your ethnic background is or your religious background, where in the Chinese context, it's this ethnicity. And of course, in the Chinese context, it's very, very complicated because there's many ethnicities there, to be honest. And that it's very difficult to say what is actually Chinese if you look back in history. But this is a different topic, and hopefully we can pivot back to the free and open Indo-Pacific discussion.
Good morning, Stephen. Good
See,
evening,
I said
everyone.
Makan, and he came in.
No. FYI, I'm in front of my laptop. I was doing some work. I forgot to press a button. I was invited. I forgot to press the button. So thank you very much for having me. Okay, so I understand you want to pivot back to basically Abenomics and Indo-Pacific, but the cultural thing, I could write a whole book on it. I could speak 2 hours on it, but I think there's some inaccuracies on what's discussed. But anyway, we can do that at a later time. Back to Abenomics. Okay, Steve, I understand that you mentioned, and we have discussed before as well, that his economic policy has been a failure. I would sort of rephrase that. Okay. It's not just me, but basically it's a sort of a consensus among economists and policy people like myself that Abenomics, as he defined, was a failure because he did first arrow, monetary easing, second arrow, fiscal expansion. He failed at the third arrow, which was basically structural reforms. But again, what structural reform? There are so many aspects to it, and Abenomics is not his only economic legacy. So as he defined, it may be a failure. But overall, if you think from the big picture, his 8 years or so in power, Japan has had basically an almost unprecedented time period of prosperity, very low unemployment, and actual economic growth. Despite low wages, low wage growth and economic growth, things have been happening. Things like more women participation in the labor force. That has happened and has been happening. Corporate governance reforms could be better, but he jump-started the process. So yes, Abenomics was a failure, but his economic policy is actually positive. And I mentioned before to Stephen that I think Abe's death shocked all of us. But I think, in my opinion, Abe, former Prime Minister Abe may not be with us anymore, but Abeism lives on. Basically, his thinking on how to reinvigorate basically the Japanese economy has been institutionalized not only in the LDP across various factions, but in the government as well. Even Prime Minister Kishida, he said like he wants to move away from Abenomics. But I think he has been indelibly influenced by his thinking on various things, including structural reform. So, just sort of as a final note, his structural reform has not moved as expected, as he promised politically. But he jump-started a lot of things that was not in place before he came to power in 2012. This really requires a more in-depth sort of study. Maybe more books, more articles should be written on this. How do I say? When I mention a consensus among economists, it's a superficial consensus, I think. It's because I think the policy circles are still sort of digesting the shock and impact of his assassination. This topic will basically be with us for many years to come, I think. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Raymond. And he's my twin in Singapore because we have a lot of shared food interests, but also a passion for understanding Japan in a more nuanced direction. And I think we often agree much more than we disagree. And I like how you really talked about how Abenomics or Abeism is now, I think, the standard operating procedure for the LDP. And this is what I wrote in the Pacific Forum, is that I think it's institutionalized now. And that is probably positive. And can we do more? Yes. And I think that's the trick, is how do we speed up some of these processes to get more sustainable momentum? And these are open questions, and I think the policy community has lots of ideas, but to move a $5 trillion economy takes some time to shift, and we'll have to see where it goes.
Sorry, one last note. So the current Prime Minister Kishida and Abe, they were the strongest supporters of Japan's innovation policy to jumpstart and to develop the VC, venture capital and startup space. Because to be honest, that is the way to go. Digitalization, technology, the new economy. Both gentlemen basically concur on the extreme critical importance of that for the Japanese economy. That's the way forward for Japan. There's really little other way. Thank you.
I agree, Raymond, but on your next visit to Japan, please go to the Ward office and experience the undigitized world.
Lots of experience, lots of such experience. I live in Japan 13 years, FYI, for everyone.
Stephen, do you have any comments in addition to Raymond's?
I think he's got it right. Raymond and I talk a lot about different issues offline. But yeah, I think, again, the idea of Abeism continuing on the domestic and international front, this is, one of his enduring legacies. And I think it's a positive legacy. And I don't want to whitewash some of the negative side of him, or the divisive side of him. But today's focus is on the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, the convergences and divergences. And I think that successful Abeism at home will enhance Japan's ability to have a sustainable free and open Indo-Pacific vision. And I think that as Raymond highlighted, that all of this leads to any kind of positive foreign policy must come from positive domestic change. And Abe, in his formulation of his broader vision for Japan, came from the Meiji period, from the initial Hans, they're called the Chosun Han, that understood that security comes from having a strong economy. Strong economy came from development and modernization. And I think that he understood that in his modern policy, and this is why he chose Abenomics to be the core of his policies, and this is why he talked about economic change and economic reforms first before he adopted security policy, and then pivoted back to economics and pivoted back to security. And this is why he took those approaches, and this is why I think he sees, and Japan now sees, the free and open Indo-Pacific vision largely through development, infrastructure, connectivity, trade agreements, standard setting, rather than a focus just on security.
Yes, indeed. And Raymond, I believe that there is a comment to what you actually said about Abe and the Abeism. So it's in the room chat. So it is like interesting about, so the analysis, your analysis of Abenomics is interesting. Yes, institutionalized, but also with regards to the labor force, many women and men may be temporarily workers, which helps keep the unemployment rate low. But otherwise, I agree with the Indo-Pacific peace and economic treaties. This is definitely a move forward. This is from Tomoko, who is in the she's in the audience now. So we've got also Mosen.
Hi, Maya. Hi, everybody.
Hi, hello. What are your thoughts today?
Sure. Actually, I have a question from Stephen. Thank you very much for the interesting topic, Maya. Hi, everybody. I'm based in München. I don't know. I assume it's going to be evening there. So, Konbanwa, that's correct. So, it's a very interesting topic. But Stephen, you mentioned something about a collaborative approach. Actually, you mentioned the Chinese scholar and kind of, let's say, Confucianist, something, if I pronounce it well, approach. That the Chinese actually they tend to have a collaboration between the neighboring countries, and I can understand why, of course, because China has more than other nations a lot of neighbors. So to speak, we can also put it in the geopolitical context. Maybe a danger, yeah. That's also a challenge for China, a very big country with a lot of neighbors. But to me, when Chinese they look at Europe these days, especially about the Ukrainian crisis, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we can see also the same approach from some European nations, especially Germany. Germans, they had a lot of ties with Russia, and they believe that perhaps these collaborations might desecuritize the threat of Russia, so to speak. Of course, we cannot exclude the US influence in Ukraine, that's for sure, and also the different views Germans and France and Germany and Britain, US had, according to Ukrainian crisis and the expansion of NATO to east and containing Russia actually. So then that gets me to the question. Then when Chinese see this approach that doesn't work in Europe, how they want to then apply their own legacies, especially annexing Taiwan back to the homeland, which is actually one of the important strategic legacies that they have for the next 10 years. And that's for sure. I don't know how these two can be summed up into one content. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Mohsen. I think your question revolves around this idea: does economic engagement decrease the chances for conflict, if I understood it correctly? And you made the point about Germany and Russia. Germany made the calculation that investment in Russia may desecuritize the region. Well, I think that in the context of the Indo-Pacific region, I think China's view is that economic relations will create asymmetric dependencies on the Chinese market, and that will make it more difficult for Chinese trade partners to take positions that go counter to Beijing's interests. Now, there's been some examples of that. So South Korea installed the THAAD missile system in 2017, and it enjoyed economic sanctions. Japan nationalized the Senkaku Islands in 2012, and it enjoyed some economic coercion. Our Australian friends called for an international investigation about the origins of COVID-19, and they're still under some economic coercion. So there is a sense that, from Beijing's point of view, that economic or these asymmetric economic dependencies can create and shift the decision-making of certain countries. But when we look at those three countries I mentioned, South Korea didn't really change its position. Japan hasn't changed its position. Australia hasn't changed its position. So it shows that there's limits to what economic coercion can do to shape behavior. Now, pivoting back to the Indo-Pacific, what we see now is more Indo-Pacific visions or guidelines are now talking more about resilience, friend-shoring, building alternative supply chains. That doesn't mean decoupling from China, but it means selective diversification of particular supply chains as part of a broader effort to become less dependent on the Chinese economy, with the hope that this could, again, constrain some of its behavior. Whether this is possible, I really don't know. It took 40 years to build the current production network with a lot of investment from outside countries. And it'll probably take at least another 20 years to selectively diversify enough to have more economic, freedom from those dependency that Beijing would like to cultivate. And we should also be aware that China is also selectively diversifying away from Western economies, or so-called advanced economies, through the dual circulation model, as well as the Belt Road Initiative. So this is an interactive process, and we really don't know the direction and what's the final destination, except that there's a sense both in the countries surrounding China, but also in China, that there needs to be a recalibration in economic relations to enhance security. And this goes back to ideas of economic security.
Thanks, Stephen.
You're welcome. Through diversification, through resilience, through standard setting. And these are going to be important in shaping the region moving forward. Of course, how the United States and the lessons the United States takes from this process will also be important. And will the Biden administration or a future administration shift more towards thinking about the Indo-Pacific region through a similar view as Japan? Well, that is, I think, the hope for many, because it's a less zero-sum approach, it's a less securitized approach, and it will create more opportunities for cooperation in building the region, but also constraining some of China's behavior, which I think is the driver of some of the partnerships that have emerged within the region.
Yes, we definitely need more partners aligned in this vision. So let's hope that there will be more, stronger agreement, and once again aligned goals and strategies for the better of the Indo-Pacific. So thank you very much, Stephen. And there is just one thing which I would like to bring to the attention of everybody in the room. So Han, before she left, she recommended a book about Abe's Indo-Pacific region, and the book is titled Line of Advantage, written by Dr. Mike Green. So Han recommends that everybody read this book if you have any, let's say if you're interested in what is happening here in the Indo-Pacific. So with this, again, thank you, Stephen, and thank you everybody who joined us up on stage and stayed with us in the audience. Now I wish you a great week ahead, and please stay safe and well.
Thank you, Stephen. This was Japan Expert Insights on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air in 2 weeks on Monday at 8:30 p.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make every day count. See you.